I want to begin with something that genuinely caught U.S. intelligence off guard. Over recent weeks, behind closed doors, a realization has been settling across Washington that very few are willing to articulate publicly. My analysis indicates senior analysts, defense planners, and intelligence officers are quietly acknowledging that Russia is not weakening in the manner the West assumed. In fact, what stunned them wasn't a single battlefield event or dramatic announcement, but a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Russia is operating as if it fully expects this conflict to last many years, and more importantly, as if it is structurally prepared for that reality. This realization didn't emerge from Russian rhetoric or propaganda. It came from hard indicators: industrial output, force regeneration, political stability, economic adaptation, and strategic patience. The shock is this. While Western governments still discuss timelines measured in months and election cycles, Russia is behaving like a state settled into prolonged confrontation. That gap in expectations is now triggering alarm bells inside the U.S. national security apparatus. Capability and endurance, the realist framework. When I examine this situation through a realist lens, the first thing I focus on is not intentions or morality, but capability and endurance. Wars between great powers are not decided by speeches or headlines. They're decided by which side can sustain pressure longer under conditions of stress. My analysis indicates Russia entered this conflict with a fundamentally different theory of victory than the United States and its NATO allies assumed. Washington framed this war as a short to medium-term crisis that would degrade Russian power, strain its economy, and eventually force Moscow into either concessions or internal instability. Russia, by contrast, appears to have framed this as a long war against the combined economic, military, and political pressure of the West. Once you understand that mismatch, many developments that confuse Western observers begin to make sense. Industrial mobilization, the West's miscalculation. I want to be absolutely clear. This is not admiration, approval, or moral endorsement. This is cold analysis. States that expect long wars organize themselves differently than states expecting short ones. Russia has shifted its economy toward war production in a manner Western societies have not. My analysis demonstrates that Russian defense industrial output has been steadily rising, not collapsing. Ammunition production, armored vehicle refurbishment, drone manufacturing, and missile output have all adjusted to wartime demand. This is not accidental. It reflects a political system that can absorb economic pain, redirect resources, and suppress internal opposition without facing immediate electoral consequences. The manpower question, a fundamental misunderstanding. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this conflict is manpower. In the West, manpower shortages are politically catastrophic. Casualties drive media narratives, elections, and public support. In Russia, the political system is structured to absorb losses in a manner that would be unacceptable in NATO countries. My analysis indicates Russia has built a force regeneration model based on partial mobilization, contract soldiers, regional recruitment, and long-term rotation. This doesn't mean infinite manpower, but it does mean substantially higher tolerance for sustained attrition. Western planners assumed Russian losses would produce political collapse or elite revolt. That assumption has not materialized, and the longer it fails to materialize, the more dangerous the miscalculation becomes. Economic resilience. Sanctions didn't work as planned. Another element intelligence analysts are now openly discussing is economic resilience. Early in the war, there was widespread confidence in Washington that sanctions would cripple Russia's ability to function as a modern state. My analysis indicates sanctions have certainly imposed costs, but they have not produced strategic paralysis. Russia has reoriented trade flows, stabilized its currency, maintained energy revenues to alternative markets, prioritized defense spending over civilian consumption. This is precisely what states do when preparing for prolonged confrontation. Western economies, meanwhile, are attempting to fund a proxy war without mobilizing their own societies for sacrifice. That asymmetry matters more with each passing year. The time horizon trap. I also want to address the issue of time horizons because this is where the strategic imbalance becomes most acute. In my analysis, Russia is playing a long game measured in decades, while the West is trapped in a short game measured in election cycles. U.S. administrations change, European governments fall, public attention shifts. Russia's leadership structure is designed for continuity, not rapid turnover, which allows Moscow to absorb short-term setbacks in pursuit of long-term objectives. Western policymakers often interpret this patience as weakness or desperation. In reality, it's a classic great power strategy when facing a coalition that is politically fragmented. Military adaptation, the attrition strategy. The military dimension reinforces this pattern. Russia has adapted its operational methods over time. Early failures gave way to defensive depth, layered air defenses, extensive drone use, electronic warfare, and attritional tactics designed to grind down Western-supplied forces. My analysis indicates Russia is not seeking dramatic breakthroughs for political effect. It's seeking steady pressure that imposes cumulative costs on Ukraine and its backers. This approach aligns perfectly with a long war strategy. Western audiences conditioned to expect rapid results often misread slow advances as failure. In a war of exhaustion, speed is not the primary metric of success. The escalation trap, diverging incentives. What truly worries me as a realist is how this mismatch in expectations feeds escalation risk. When one side believes time is on its side and the other believes time is against it, incentives diverge dangerously. My analysis indicates Russia believes it can wait out Western unity, while parts of the Western policy community increasingly fear that delays favor Moscow. That creates pressure in Washington and European capitals to escalate support, loosen restrictions, and expand the scope of involvement. From Russia's perspective, those escalations confirm its original belief that it's not fighting Ukraine alone, but the West as a system. This dynamic is structurally unstable. The more the West escalates to avoid defeat, the more Russia doubles down on preparation for even longer confrontation. Each side interprets the other's actions as confirmation of hostile intent. There's very little room for signaling restraint because both sides believe backing down would be interpreted as weakness. My analysis suggests this is exactly the kind of environment in which miscalculation becomes likely, not because leaders are irrational, but because they're operating under incompatible assumptions about time, endurance, and acceptable risk. Societal mobilization, the psychological dimension. Another factor intelligence analysts are now quietly emphasizing is societal mobilization. Russia has adjusted public expectations. The conflict has been normalized within its political narrative. Economic hardship is framed as sacrifice. Isolation is framed as sovereignty. In the West, by contrast, leaders have attempted to insulate their populations from the costs of war. Energy prices, inflation, and budget trade-offs generate political backlash. My analysis indicates societies that are psychologically prepared for long conflict behave very differently from societies told the conflict will remain distant and manageable. NATO's Achilles heel, coalition endurance. I also want to address the alliance dimension, because this is where Western vulnerability becomes most pronounced. NATO is not a humanitarian actor. It's a coalition of states with different threat perceptions, economic capacities, and domestic constraints. Russia understands this deeply. My analysis indicates Moscow's long war strategy is designed not just to exhaust Ukraine, but to strain NATO cohesion over time. Disagreements over funding, weapons transfers, and escalation thresholds are not anomalies. They're predictable outcomes of prolonged conflict among democracies. From a realist perspective, Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO militarily. It only needs to outlast NATO politically. That distinction is often lost in public debate. Western military superiority matters, but only if it can be sustained over time. My analysis indicates Russia is betting that Western unity will erode before Russian capacity does. That bet may or may not succeed, but it's not irrational. It's grounded in historical patterns of coalition warfare. The nuclear shadow. The nuclear dimension looms in the background of all this. Even when not explicitly discussed, Russia's nuclear posture is designed to deter direct NATO intervention. My analysis indicates Moscow believes it has successfully imposed escalation ceilings that the West is reluctant to cross. As long as that perception holds, Russia feels secure enough to pursue a long conventional conflict. Western leaders, aware of nuclear risks, calibrate their support carefully. This mutual restraint keeps the war contained, but it also locks both sides into a grinding stalemate that favors the actor more prepared for endurance. Preparedness versus victory. I want to emphasize that preparedness for long conflict doesn't mean inevitability of victory. It means resilience. It means the ability to absorb shocks without strategic collapse. My analysis indicates Russia has structured its political economy, military planning, and strategic messaging around that principle. The West, by contrast, has treated this war as an extraordinary but temporary crisis. That difference is now becoming painfully visible to intelligence professionals who track long-term indicators rather than daily headlines. The psychological asymmetry. There's also a psychological element that shouldn't be underestimated. Russian leadership appears comfortable with uncertainty and isolation. Western policymakers are deeply uncomfortable with open-ended commitments. My analysis indicates this asymmetry shapes decision-making at every level. Russia is willing to accept ambiguity about outcomes as long as its core security concerns are addressed over time. The West seeks clarity, benchmarks, and exit strategies. When those are absent, political support weakens. The core concern: strategic alignment with reality. As a senior analyst, what concerns me most is not that Russia is stronger than the West, but that Russia may be more strategically aligned with the reality of prolonged confrontation. Wars often end not when one side collapses, but when one side loses the will or capacity to continue. My analysis indicates Russia has already crossed the psychological threshold into long war mode, while the West is still debating whether that mode is necessary. The danger ahead. This brings me to the most sobering part of my assessment. The longer this conflict continues under current assumptions, the more dangerous it becomes. If Western leaders continue to underestimate Russia's preparedness, they may escalate in ways that increase the risk of direct confrontation. If Russia continues to believe it can outlast the West indefinitely, it may take risks of its own. Neither side is seeking catastrophe, but both are maneuvering within a system that rewards endurance and punishes hesitation. Conclusion: structure, not emotion. I want to end by stressing this is not a prediction of imminent collapse or dramatic escalation. It's a warning about structure. My analysis indicates we're in a situation where one side is organized for a marathon and the other is still thinking in terms of sprints. That mismatch doesn't guarantee an outcome, but it does guarantee prolonged tension, rising costs, and narrowing margins for error. History demonstrates that wars shaped by misaligned expectations rarely end cleanly. They end when exhaustion forces decisions that leaders once believed they could avoid. That is the danger we're approaching, not because of emotion or ideology, but because of the cold logic of great power conflict unfolding in reality. The shock for U.S. intelligence isn't that Russia is winning. The shock is that Russia is prepared to keep fighting long after the West assumed they'd collapse. And in wars of attrition, preparation often matters more than superiority.